Let's now talk about lines of action, right? What are lines of action? You may or may not have heard of what lines of action are. We're going to look at it and we're going to dissect it. And I'm going to use this baseball kid photo again, just to illustrate the point here. So really, you get a primary line of action and a secondary line of action in your characters, or secondary lines of action, mind you. So in this particular piece, when I look at this character, I'll mark out his head, and then I'll determine for myself, based on what I see, where the primary line of action is. And the primary line of action is the line that really describes and kind of summarizes the overall movement of that particular pose, right? So the primary line of action is just the line that shows that overall movement, that overall directional movement. And the line of action generally takes shape as some kind of C-curve. So it could be very kind of short C-curves or really bent C-curves, or some kind of S-curves where you have these types of shapes happening, kind of little ones and big ones or something like that. And they really summarize and kind of categorize into the overarching story really of the total movement of the entire body, right? So the line of action really, it shows the line of action in the form, right? The line of action in the form. It doesn't have any particularly clear directionality to it, other than in this instance kind of shows his weighting kind of moving there, but really it's just the line of action running from the head through the form. Not to be confused with the center line, not to be confused with the spinal line, right? The line of action is a gestural line. It doesn't really exist per se, but it's something that we're using, we want to see in the form of the general directional movement of the form. And this main line that runs through the form is the primary line of action, right? The primary line of action. Consequently, secondary lines of action are lines that come from the primary line of action and flow from it in a very natural way. If they aren't flowing from it, then the secondary line of action aren't good. Now, usually in real people, the secondary line of action generally always makes sense unless something terrible has happened to the person where their joints are all out of whack. But nevertheless, and let's draw in some secondary lines of action here, which really follow the opposing curves theory. Right, so here we have it curving over and then under, and then this arm does the same thing, right? So the secondary lines of action kind of flow from the main line of action. And this leg here, the nearest leg, really follows in step with the primary line of action. And so these blue lines represent the secondary lines of action, which really, I've overcomplicated them here a little bit, but really they show the overall summary of the movement in the limbs, right? The limbs and the head and legs. So we can also simplify them more if you're not in an opposing curves mindset or you really want to just draw it out quickly. And we would just do these kind of simple curves just to show the secondary line of action in a much more simple way there with the purple lines. But since we know opposing curves theory, we might as well just use it to help us build those secondary lines of action. So in essence, that's what line of action is. The primary line of action, definitely the most important, but really it's the overall movement and the overall gestural movement and kind of flow of the entire body, right? That is what the primary line of action represents. And then the secondary line of action is there to help us add in flow, in step, in opposing curves, in a dynamic flow, the limbs, the arms, the legs, as well as the head, as they flow out from that primary line of action flow. And why do we learn this? Because this is the very best way to start off capturing the gesture of a reference or of a real person very quickly when we're trying to learn more about the forms. We will start with the line of action. Nevertheless, we'll get to those demos. Let's move on to the next lesson.